Okay, so are you ready to dive into this? We're tackling the Black Death today.
Yeah, let's do it. This was really going to be fascinating to unpack.
These sources you sent over, wow, just like intense. I mean, 30 to 60% of Europe's population gone.
It's hard to even fathom, right? And the thing is, it's not just about the immediate loss of life, which is, obviously horrific on its own, but this pandemic, it really did reshape the course of history, big time.
Yeah, one article I was reading, it mentioned like these 12 Genoese trading ships arriving in Sicily back in 1347 and the decks full of dying
It's
sailors.
a chilling image, right? And it
Yeah.
speaks to the role that the Black Sea region, where those ships were coming from, played in the spread of this pandemic.
So they brought more than just goods, huh?
Right. They unwittingly brought with them rats.
Ah, the rats.
But
Classic.
not just any rats, right? These rats were carrying fleas, and those fleas, infected with a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. That's our culprit, right there. That little microorganism is behind the Black Death.
Okay, so this isn't just bad luck we're talking about, is it? This is like a whole confluence of factors. Trade routes, I mean, those were the highways of the medieval world.
Exactly. And the plague basically hitched a ride on those highways, spread by the rats as they moved from city to city.
And they had no idea what was hitting them, right?
Now imagine facing this invisible enemy without even knowing it existed. They had no concept of contagion, no understanding of how a disease is actually spread.
So what did they think was causing it?
Back then, bad air, divine wrath. Those were the common explanations.
Wow. Speaking of, well, not knowing what was going on, let's talk about the plague itself. What did it actually look like? Because I kept seeing this word, boobles.
Yes, the buboes.
Ah.
You see, when someone had the plague, they developed these, well, imagine painful, swollen lymph nodes. And they often appeared in, like, the groin, the armpits, the neck. It was a telltale sign of bubonic plague, which was one of the forms the Black Death took.
And just to be clear, like, this wasn't the only symptom.
Right.
Like,
Oh, definitely not. Your research was spot on. You had chills, fever, seizures. You even had gangrene in some cases. And,
yeah,
well, death often followed within a few days of the first symptoms appearing.
that's
It
terrifying.
was a horrific way to go.
So, I mean, I can only imagine, right? People were desperate for a cure. But you've got some notes here on what they were trying back then, and some of this stuff sounds brutal. Bloodletting. Seriously.
Yeah, no, it sounds barbaric to us now, but it was a common medical practice for centuries. They believed that by balancing the bodily fluids, they called them humors, they could restore health.
Yeah, and we know now, obviously, that that didn't really work.
Yeah, it probably did more harm than good.
So was anything they were trying effective? Or was it just kind of a lost cause from the beginning?
Well, you have to remember, this is the 14th century.
Mm.
No microscopes, no real understanding of germ theory.
Yeah.
Treating the Black Death back then, it was like shooting in the dark.
So basically, they were just throwing anything they could at it and hoping something would stick.
Exactly. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, some even tried strapping live toads to the buboes. Anything to combat something they didn't understand.
So while they're, trying all these different treatments, the plague's still spreading like wildfire, right? Did they try to contain it at all?
They did, actually. I mean, their scientific understanding was, well, limited, to say the least. But they weren't totally in the dark.
Okay, so what did they do?
Some cities started implementing quarantines, like they'd seal up infected houses, restrict movement, things like that, which is kind of amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, like those are the early versions of what we do now, right? Public health measures and all that.
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about this. As horrific as it was, the Black Death kind of forced these changes, these shifts in how societies operated.
Right, because you can't just have something like that happen and it not leave a mark. And I know you wanted to talk about the long-term consequences, right? Not just the immediate death toll, but how it changed Europe. One article called it like an inflection point for European history, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Think about it. The economic impact alone is huge. You have this massive portion of the labor force just gone.
And suddenly, the people who survived, especially the ones who were already, working the land, farming, that kind of thing, they're in a totally different position.
Exactly. Fewer workers means their skills are more valuable. They can demand better wages, better conditions.
So the plague basically upended the power dynamic.
It's a classic case of supply and demand,
Yeah.
you know, but with huge social consequences. And that's actually a big part of what led to the decline of serfdom, over time.
Wow. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing to think that this horrible plague actually played a role in dismantling, like, a centuries-old social order.
And it wasn't just the economic side of things either. The church, which had been, this dominant force, they faced a serious crisis too.
Oh, right, because they were saying it was God's wrath, right? But then everyone's dying, good and bad alike, and it's like, wait, maybe there's something else going on here.
Exactly. People started questioning the church's authority, their whole ability to explain what was happening or to even offer any kind of comfort.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing, right? Like social upheaval, economic change, religious doubt, everything's getting shaken up. It makes you wonder how people even coped with all that. It's interesting. We've talked about how the Black Death impacted like society, the economy, even religion. But one thing I found really surprising in these sources was the way it influenced art and culture.
It's kind of a wild juxtaposition when you think about it, right? This
Mm.
period of just immense suffering and death, but it also gave rise to this incredible wave of creativity.
Yeah, like one of the articles mentioned something called the Dance of Death, which I'll be honest, sounds a little creepy.
It is a bit, yeah. Basically, imagine skeletons, right? Those grinning symbols of
Hmm.
mortality. And they're leading people from all walks of life, kings, queens, peasants, everyone in this big macabre dance towards their graves.
So it's like this very in your face reminder that death comes for us all.
Exactly. And that motif, the dance of death, it really took hold. You saw it in paintings, sculptures, literature. The Black Death really forced people to confront their own mortality, and you see that reflected in their art.
It's like by acknowledging death, they were also celebrating life in a way.
That's a good way to put it. And that focus on the human experience, on life and death and our place in it all, it carried on. It even influenced the Renaissance.
Oh, wow. That's a fascinating connection. So, the Black Death, as devastating as it wasn't just about destruction, right? It pushed people to change, to innovate, whether it was in medicine or in how they saw the world around them.
For sure. And those changes, they're still with us today.
Totally. I mean, think about it. The Black Death forced people to start thinking about sanitation, about isolating the sick, right?
Hmm.
And those practices, which seem so basic now, they were born out of necessity back then, but they formed the foundation for like epidemiology, public health.
Right. It's amazing how that works.
It's like even in the darkest of times, humanity finds a way to adapt, to learn, to move forward. It's also kind of humbling. What started with those plague-ridden ships in Sicily eventually led to the public health measures that we just like take for granted today.
And it shows how interconnected history is, right?
Yeah.
One event, no matter how catastrophic, it can have these ripple effects that continue to shape the world for centuries.
This whole deep dive has been quite the eye-opener. I mean, it's just incredible to think about how the Black Death, something so tragic, so devastating, it also led to some pretty incredible changes. Changes that are still with us today.
That's what makes digging into history so fascinating, right? You never know what you're going to find.
Absolutely. So, here's something to think about as we wrap up today. If the Black Death hadn't happened, would we even be having this conversation right now? Would our world be completely different? It's something to ponder.